soil fertility for growing in gardens, greenhouses, orchards, and landscaped areas. Some people think all those are different. What we really find is when you have your soil right, it works for all those. The thing that I'll say is we do thousands of samples from all over the world, 80 different countries, and many of those are gardens. Some are conventional, some are organic. About 2/3 of our work is with conventional growers and about 1/3 with certified organic growers, and some of those are both. Of all the gardens we receive, I do well if I see one a month that we say, this garden is such fertile soil, there's nothing you could do to improve it. Am I saying everything's wrong with gardens? No. All I'm saying is there is so much more to growing a crop than just saying, let's plant it and if it grows, it's going to be good. If it grows, it's going to be better than not growing. But when I first started, we started with growers. We said, we specialize in problem soils. And for the first 5 years, most of the soils we worked with were problems that someone said, this is just not growing right. But you know what we found? Even after you get a soil where it can grow something that looks good, that doesn't always mean it is good. The man who taught me, Dr. William Albrecht, had made a movie in the 1940s called The Other Side of the Fence. And he held up 2 carrots. They looked the same. He said, this carrot really doesn't have any nutritive value in it at all. And this carrot is a very nutritional thing to eat. Both of them look the same. Just because we look at something and it looks good does not mean that's what we need. Soil fertility for better landscapes. I put that in there because a lot of people think, well, you know, flowers and shrubs and trees are different than vegetables. As far as the fertility that's required, I don't know of a plant in the world. And we work with all different types of plants from the tropics to the frigid parts of the poles. Anything will grow wherever. And you know what? If you get the soil right, every one of those plants do their best. And it's not a matter of it's got to be exact, but there are parameters that you have to meet. You can't have less than this, you can't have more than this, or it's going to affect something else. Same thing holds true with flowers as it does with vegetables. Today we're going to concentrate more on the vegetable portion of it. There. No matter how many or how different the soils and the crops on your land may be, the laws of science still work the same for all of them. By that I mean, whether we're in Australia or whether we're in Africa or whether we're in the US, the law of gravity still works the same. So does every law of chemistry, so does every law of physics, so does every law of biology. And those are the 3 things that we are most concerned about. Anywhere in the world, the laws of science are the same. As long as we do it using something that we can measure, something that we can get the same answer wherever we are. So when we're looking at soil to grow bananas in Africa, we use the same principles that we do with soil growing bananas in Central America. We use the same principles that we do for growing apples here in Ohio, or for growing carrots, or for growing whatever else you may be wanting to grow. Now, in this short time, there are a lot of things that could be said, but I'm just going to concentrate and I'll be sort of jumping around. But for those of you in the audience, if you have a garden, do you have problems getting enough blooms on your vegetables and flowering plants? Now, this is just a tip. This has nothing to do with the soil side of it, because we'll have clients that will do what they're supposed to do as close as they can, and they'll call up and say, I've got these tomatoes. They look great, but they don't have any blooms on them. If you're having trouble getting blooms, just take a teaspoon of apple cider vinegar, a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar, 1 tablespoon, put it in a gallon of water. Pour that in a pump-up sprayer and just mist it on your tomatoes or whatever else you're having trouble getting blooms on. If it's a flower, whatever it may be. Just mist it. Don't wet it down so that it drips. Just get a mist on it. Just wait about 3 days. And all of a sudden, those plants start blooming because we're supplying some nutrients they need that they're not getting somehow. But a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in a gallon of water will actually help put more blooms on tomatoes or whatever else. If you say, I got blooms on there, but they're dropping off, they're not forming fruit. Well, then if you get plenty of blooms, but you don't get fruit, put a tablespoon of household ammonia, the same ammonia you use to clean your windows with in the house. Tablespoon of household ammonia in a gallon of water, and mist it on your plants. Just see if it doesn't start setting those fruits. Some people get plenty of blooms, they just don't get fruit. Some people don't get enough blooms. Once they get the blooms, fruit's fine. Some people don't get the blooms, still don't get enough fruit, so they have to do both. That's something that can help. Does that solve the problem? Well, it solves the immediate problem, but you're going to have it keep coming back and keep coming back until we find out what it is that needs to be done. So that what we want to do is look at the soil and solve the problem so that we don't have to keep doing it over and over and over every year. We look at fertility in that way because that's what makes a difference. That makes a big difference in terms of the things that happen. And what are we looking for? Producing good, nutritious food should be the chief and immediate short-term goal. Growers should consider this first to keep going. And good plant health is a key here. Good plant health doesn't just come just because we plant it and then go out there and hold the weeds out or put the mulch around or whatever it may be. Good plant health has there's more to good plant health than that. And that is, we have to have the right nutrients there in order to solve the problem. If we have a problem, there's something wrong. And if there's something wrong, what is it that we have to do to make it right? Here's a big problem though. If you've got a garden and it's all the same soil, well, then that becomes easy. But if you've got a garden and part of it over here goes one way and part over here goes another way, part of it's a red soil, part of it's a black soil, part of it's a brown soil or a gray soil or whatever it may be, if you analyze those soils, they're a different color because they have a different makeup. If you have a part of the garden that grows more of one type of grass or weed than the rest of it, it's there because it has a different nutrient makeup. The question is it large enough for you to say, I'll take care of it separately? I'll find out what it needs, and I'll put it on that part, but not necessarily on the rest of the garden. Some people say, I just want to grow plants. If that's what you want to do, then that can be done easily. But if you want to grow plants that have the very highest nutrient-dense nutrition, you have to get the nutrients right in the soil in the first place. Because every time you have a soil that has too much of one thing, it will not have enough of something else. You can't get a soil that has too much of everything. Everything you put on your soil affects it either positively or negatively. We're just going to hit on a few places here, but what can safely be done? No poisons needed to keep insects from chewing holes in the leaves of your small green bean plants and keep them for the whole season. When you plant a green bean in your garden, it comes up like that, just watch and see when does something start chewing holes in the leaf. When you see the first holes come in that leaf, it's time for you to do something. And I'm going to tell you that what's happening is that bean is not getting enough magnesium. It's not getting enough magnesium. And what will happen if you go in there and if you wanted to spend the money and take enough of those plants and send them off, what would happen is that bean would come back and show you that, well, this plant is deficient in magnesium. And the key is magnesium only becomes available to plants in one narrow amount in every soil. If you have less than 10% of the nutrient holding capacity of your soil is less than 10% is magnesium, you're going to get holes in your green bean leaves. But on a clay soil, If it's more than 12%, you're still going to get holes in the green bean leaves, because if you have less than 10, you have a magnesium deficiency, and if you have more than 12, because a soil that has too much magnesium will not get enough. And guess what? In Ohio, most of the soils we have don't have magnesium deficiency. If you've got light sand, maybe so. But most soils have a magnesium excess, above 12%. So I could say probably most of your gardens, now you can go out there and spray the beans and so forth. I don't like to spray anything. I want to grow everything as natural as possible. So when I watch my green bean leaves, and yes, I get holes chewed in the green beans in my garden, because the garden we had for 40 years was at another house. We built a new home, moved 30 minutes away, moved from sand to heavy clay. And that heavy clay still has too much magnesium. We've lived there 9 years, and I'm still working on it. But the insects start chewing in the leaf. What you do is take a tablespoon of Epsom salts. 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt. Same thing you use to soak your feet in, or some put it in their bath water or whatever. 11% magnesium sulfate. You can buy it at the drugstore. Take that Epsom salt, put a tablespoon in a gallon of water, put it in a pump-up sprayer, and go mist the leaves. And whatever's chewing holes in those leaves will quit for about 3 to 4 weeks. Just watch the beans. And when they start chewing holes in those beans again, do it again. You might have to do it every 3 or 4 weeks, because it's just showing that bean's still not getting enough magnesium. One of the biggest problems we have in terms of food crops, not necessarily reported that way, but one of the biggest problems we have is getting enough magnesium into our food. And when you talk to a heart specialist, what they'll tell you is that's one of the biggest problems we have for our heart. We're not getting enough magnesium. What's one of the biggest killers in the U.S.? Heart disease. Is it because we're not putting the magnesium where it needs to be? We're not even checking necessarily for the food to come out of the stores and so forth. Nobody cares, because you know what? Most people would tell you, involved in agriculture, magnesium doesn't make any difference at all. If all you're looking to do is go bulk, maybe not. But if you're looking to go quality, yes it does. So tip for insect control: foliar magnesium on your garden plants. Mix 1 tablespoon of Epsom salts per gallon of water and mist it on the leaves every 3 to 4 weeks. If it works for you, don't say, oh boy, that's great, I'm going to do it every week. Because if you do, that's too much. And it'll actually start drying those plants out. You won't get, even though you may have enough water, it'll begin to dry those plants every 3 to 4 weeks. And even then, if you're a big producer, run some tests and see, well, do I have enough magnesium or not? But if you're a gardener, easier to do this. Just watch for the holes in the leaves. When you spray those green beans, I sprayed my 2 rows of green beans and had a whole lot left. So I thought, well, I'll just spray the cucumbers and the corn and basically I sprayed the whole thing in a small home garden. You know what? In 3 days, you could tell it, because everything turned greener. It looked green. It looked like, well, everything looks good. But in 3 days' time, everything turned greener. Why is that? Because magnesium is the center of chlorophyll, and the nitrogen has to attach around it. And until we get enough magnesium there, we can't use the nitrogen to keep those plants as green as they should be to build chlorophyll. We're feeding the plants, we're feeding ourselves. If you're looking at sweet corn, growing sweet corn, same is true for silage corn, for popcorn, for any type of corn for grain. But when you start looking at the corn, go out there just before that corn tassels, or you can, if you're there before, that's fine. But just before the corn tassel, and look at the leaves on that stalk. And if the bottom leaf has a yellow V shape in it, that means that leaf is deficient in nitrogen. But as that nitrogen doesn't move in that plant, you have to get new nitrogen in to keep it green. So, nitrogen does move in the plant, and it pulls that out of the old leaves on into the newer ones. And so if we don't keep enough nitrogen there, the plant keeps pulling it away from the older leaves. But for every leaf that you see that has a yellow V in the tip, that means you didn't put on enough nitrogen, and that will be, depending on where your magnesium level is, If it's between 10 and 12%, that means it takes 10 pounds of nitrogen for every one of those leaves. If the magnesium is below 10%, it takes 15 pounds of nitrogen for every one of those leaves that show yellow. You walk in there and add that up. Now, if you're raising sweet corn, and you can keep the leaf where the ear is green, all those leaves below it feed the stalk. So you're still getting enough nitrogen to that sweet corn, but if you're trying to grow silage corn or popcorn or corn for grain, then what will happen is you'll start robbing the nutritional value from that grain as it matures. So once the nitrogen gets to the ear leaf, then it starts affecting how much starch is going to be put in that corn, how big the kernels will be. Potassium deficiency looks much the same as a nitrogen deficiency, except they both start in the oldest leaves, but the potassium deficiency begins right up against the stalk and will start on the outside of the leaf and move in, just like you're seeing there. It'll all turn brown from the stalk all the way out to the end. And as that leaf dies and then another dies, the more leaves die, the more that means you're short on potassium in that soil. So it's good to go out there and look, be sure, is it dying from the outside in or is it dying from the tip of the leaf back? From the tip of the leaf back is nitrogen shortage. Outside in is potassium. Many people that we talk to, even farmers, look at their corn and say, oh, we got a nitrogen deficiency, when actually they need more potassium. And like right now, when you're growing a garden or whatever, and it's getting extra dry, the first key to water uptake into a plant, once you have the minimum of everything else, potassium is the key to water use for a plant. The better your potassium levels are in that soil, in terms of what's needed, the better that potassium level is, the better you'll be able to have the plants take up water. But potassium doesn't do it by itself. It also takes zinc. So first thing we want is to have at least 2% potassium, 5% is better. If you're growing woody crops, 7.5%. We're talking percent of what? Percent of the nutrient holding capacity of that soil. The only way you know that is to measure the electrical charge, the amount of negative charge in that soil. That can be done by a soil test that expresses those in percentages. It'll tell you what your nutrient holding capacity and what percent of that capacity has potassium. We need at least 2%. If you're less than 2, you're always going to be deficient in whatever you're growing there. We see many soils that are less than 2% potassium. If you're using compost and manure, that's not general. We're going to talk about compost and manures in either today or tomorrow. I've forgotten which is this afternoon. But potassium is the first key to good water use, and zinc is the second. So zinc is necessary for moisture absorption into the plant. As far as potassium gives you bulk. It actually, once everything else is there, and we have ideal potassium, that's when you actually get the ideal starch in a potato or whatever it may be that we're trying to grow there. looking at potatoes or looking at corn, it takes that potassium in order to build the carbohydrate in the plant. Now, that's not by itself. What we need, first of all, we need enough calcium in the leaf. Calcium puts enough calcium to put the starch in the leaf. We need enough calcium to get the starch into the leaf, and then once we get the starch into the leaf, we have to have boron to move the starch out of the leaf into the fruit or the grain. So a potato is not just going to grow a good potato just by having enough potassium there. We have to have adequate calcium there, and we have to have adequate boron there. How do you get red color? If you're raising beets and they don't have a real pretty red color, or if you're raising tomatoes, they don't have a pretty red color, or even apples or grapes, one of the biggest keys to a red color in a plant is enough potassium. Now, that's not the only key, but most of the people that we're going to be talking to here don't have the second part, because if you have good potassium level and less than 0.5% sodium in the soil, you still won't get good red color. But looking at these, let's talk about tomatoes. I think that's next here. Yeah, right here. If you have tomatoes, you go out in your garden and cut them, and they've got all that white looking and on the right-hand side. If they don't look like those red ones on the other, then that's a sure potassium deficiency. Once you get your potassium there, if you have less than 0.5% sodium, then you won't necessarily still get all that deep red color, but you will get the size because the potassium actually makes the fruit bigger. Whether vegetables or flowers, what helps plants that grow roots or bulbs or tubers? What helps them grow best? It's something most people in the eastern part of the U.S. don't pay any attention to. Now, maybe you do. But in the eastern part of the U.S., we have a tremendous amount of emphasis on phosphate in the soil, and we see many soils that have extremes in terms of phosphate. But the other part that we have to have when we have an extreme of phosphate is phosphorus is antagonistic to sulfur. And used to, we got plenty of sulfur when we burned high sulfur coal, and there was sulfur in all the fuels and so on and so forth. But you know what? All that's been taken out because everybody thinks, oh, sulfur's bad. We had acid rain, we had this, we had that. Plants need sulfur. They just don't need too much. And sulfur is the key to better root systems, better tubers, better, well, whether you look at bulbs or tubers, so if we don't have enough sulfur, it will actually reduce the ability of a plant to grow a root system by about 1/3. You can get about 50% more root growth by just having adequate amounts of sulfur. Now, I can tell you in your garden, I can tell you right now that even if you put sulfur on every year, unless you have a compaction layer, or unless you're putting on huge amounts, that sulfur's going to be gone. If you're putting, say, and there are people that will tell you, you can't put sulfur on your garden, that'll kill your garden. Well, we put basically between 50 and 100 pounds of sulfur per year on our garden, per acre, on a per acre basis. I keep a note here just to tell you. 100 pounds per acre of sulfur will generally show up, they don't report it in pounds per acre, sulfur generally reported as parts per million. So 100 pounds per acre adds 50 parts per million to your soil, which is the low side of excellent. That means that if you have a 1,000 square foot garden, that means you need 2.3 pounds of sulfur per 1,000 square feet. Elemental sulfur, you can buy it at the fertilizer store. You can buy sulfur at the druggist, you know, if you just have a little bitty spot. But the sulfur at the druggist costs a whole lot more money than going out and buying it as a fertilizer at the fertilizer store. But that works out at 3.7 ounces per 100 square feet. So if you got a small area that's a flower garden or something, 4 ounces, really 4 ounces is not too much. 4 ounces just gets you a little bit above that minimum. If you put that on every year and your soil has good drainage so that the water can move through, you're not going to overdo it. But what you'll find is it'll give you 1/3 more root system. It'll give you larger bulbs if you're growing tulips or if you're growing iris or whatever it may be, garlic, onions, any one of those. But there's one other thing. If you're growing tree crops, as long as you keep that sulfur above 50 parts per million, it'll add 25% more trunk growth per year by caliper measurement. You can measure it. It's there. We need sulfur unless you're in an area where you're getting sulfur from something that generally we don't see it anymore. You can measure it. If the soil test shows less than 50 parts per million, then we recommend our client whatever it takes to get up above that 50 parts per million they put on there. If you're growing onions or garlic, do they seemingly make nice green blades but only small bulbs? Time after time, what we find there is adding that sulfur, all of a sudden they say, we got great big bulbs. Need the sulfur to grow what grows underneath. Now, we need sulfur to grow big bulbs, but we also need something else, and that is, it's needed in very small amounts, but boron fills the fruit or the grain. If you're growing apples and you always get really small fruits, I had an apple grower in Michigan, had Jonathan apples, and he said he'd grown for 20 years, and we told him, your fruit comes out small because you don't have enough boron. He said, That's the only problem we've had for all these years. We can't get big enough apples. As soon as he put the boron on, he had enough of everything else. When he put that boron on, his fruit got bigger. Why? Because boron takes the starch out of the leaf and puts it in the fruit of the grain. So, in terms of boron, I've had more people kill their plants with boron than any other thing I'm mentioning. And why? Because they didn't follow the instructions. Because they made a mistake, and when we said, well, this is how much you put on, they put on 2, 3, 4 times, sometimes 10 times too much. A good application of boron, and you can get boron as two ways. You can get boron as a soluble, which will liquefy, and you can spray in a sprayer. Now, what you want to do if you're going to use that, though, that's 20% boron, and that means you put on 10 pounds of it to the acre, and you've got 2 pounds of boron. Well, 2 pounds of boron works great sprayed on the soil. Just as long as you don't overdo that, you're not going to get into any trouble. But if you make a mistake and put 3 or 4, legumes are sensitive to boron when they're in the seedling stage. Until they get the first set of 3 leaves on, they'll just suck it up and kill them. So you can actually put a small amount of boron on your garden and cause a problem with the legumes like peas and beans, so forth, germinating. If you don't put any more than on 100 square feet, 20 pounds per acre is 3/4 of an ounce. And so 20 pounds per acre at 3/4 of an ounce, that means that if we're going to work that out on 100 square feet, then we need 0.7½ ounces per 100 square feet. Now, I'm just telling you these things to say, why is boron and sulfur, why is it that we can take a look at those and say, well, that's something to be concerned about? Because they don't stay in the soil, they leach through. Just like nitrate, nitrogen, borate, boron, and sulfate, sulfur will leach through the soil. You have to work on that year after year after year in order to be sure you have enough there. It's not something that stays, if it stays around, you got another problem because there's a compaction layer somewhere, because if the water can move through, the boron and the sulfur will move through as well, just like the nitrogen will. Not as fast, but it will move through. If you're growing sweet corn, another way to tell if you have enough boron. There will be people that tell you all kinds of things, but time and time again throughout the world we find this be the same thing. And that is, if you are growing sweet corn or field corn or popcorn and the kernels don't fill all the way out to the end, this almost filled to the end, but if it fills all the way to the end, generally there'll be a kernel right on the tip. And the further down that goes without the kernels filling, sometimes you'll see a sweet corn and that much of it just doesn't have any kernels in it. The kernels should have been there, but what we did was we had one of 2 things. Well, 3 things. The first one, we don't generally see in your gardens in Ohio, and that is most of Ohio keep their calcium levels good. You have to have enough calcium in order to get the boron in. And if you have a soil that's severely deficient in calcium, the lower the calcium saturation in the soil, the more toxic boron becomes. So on very low calcium soil, we don't even recommend boron. But once we get the calcium up there, the next thing is you have to have just enough phosphorus. And if you're using compost and manure, you're generally going to have enough phosphorus. Sometimes too much, which is a different story. We won't talk about that now. But with adequate phosphorus, you can tell on your sweet corn, because when you pull the shuck down, if you've got good phosphorus, the rows will be nice and straight. If you've got straight rows, but there's a kink in it somewhere, you cut some roots. Because that kink actually made the row move over or go to the side or whatever, that affected your phosphate uptake. But if you've got good straight rows, that means you got enough phosphate. But if they don't fill all the way out to the end, and you've got good straight rows, that means you don't have enough boron. And in general, it takes 0.8 parts per million boron, and that works just about on anybody's boron test. Some tests that we have others don't show that much. Others don't show as close. But on boron, 0.8 parts per million, you should get that to fill all the way to the end. But you know what most soils have? 0.4, 0.6. Most soils don't have a 0.8. Ideal is 1.5 to 2. And on medium to light soil, it gets hard to ever get it there. But boron fights rust and fungus diseases once you can get it up to 1.5 parts per million or higher. Now, you have to be careful about doing that, but it can be done. When to take a soil sample? Well, when you start looking at sampling and so forth, first of all, take your sample so that there's plenty of time to treat your soil in case it needs something that takes time to break down. A lot of people don't realize that when we tell a farmer or a gardener to put on limestone, when you put limestone on your soil, it's going to take at least 12 months for that calcium in the lime to become available to be able to be used by whatever you're growing there. Now, it's not saying that if you put it on right at the time you plant that it's not going to help, but calcium is designed to do more than feed the plant. If all we're trying to do is feed plants and guess what the plant needs, we're going to get in trouble. I mean, this is what most people are taught. You don't need to worry about the soil. When I learned under Dr. William Albrecht in the 1960s, late 60s, the one thing that he was saying is, you know, agriculture today is telling, don't worry about the soil, it's just there to hold the plant up. The soil just to hold the plant up. We'll tell you how much fertilizer to put on, what you need to grow this crop. And today, most agriculture is what you need to do to feed the plant. And I don't know anybody that can guess what they need to do to feed the plant, except they say, it doesn't matter. If we just get the bulk there, that's what we're looking for. Tonnage. That's not what we're looking for if we're going to eat. We're looking for nutritional values. Well, in terms of calcium, calcium doesn't just, when we put limestone on, the principal thing that's in most limestone, I don't know of any limestone that wouldn't have this as a principle, is calcium. We need calcium to take every other nutrient into the plant. You have to have calcium in the soil solution around the plant roots. At least 60% of that solution should be calcium. And if you have less than that, you don't get the right amount of nutrients in. It takes more and more nutrients to get the same response. But once you get that calcium on there and say, okay, it takes calcium to get in the phosphorus, the potassium, the nitrogen, everything else. Calcium doesn't get itself in. Calcium opens the door. It's like the doorman, or as Dr. William Albrecht used to say, calcium opens the door, or all the other elements go over the back of the calcium ion to get into the plant. But they go over the back. He said it's like leapfrog. It's not like that the calcium has to carry it in. The calcium stays outside and opens the door. But he said calcium can't open the door for itself. Something else has to get the calcium in. And we can have soils, you can have soils right in your garden that has really good calcium levels and still have a calcium deficiency in what you're growing there. Because if you don't have enough boron, boron is the only thing that takes the calcium into the plant. Most soils are deficient in boron, so it's not as easy as we might think to keep, even though we've got good calcium levels, to make sure we've got good calcium in our crops. But let's say we don't have a problem. We've got the boron, we've got the calcium. We need calcium for something more than that. Calcium has a job in the soil that is not just to feed the plant. Calcium is the key to soil structure. And calcium, when you put it on the soil, will actually cause that soil, the porosity of that soil to open up, and it'll make bigger pore space so that the water can move in more easily, but so can the air. Air and water get into the soil more easily. Calcium's job, if you've got a pond or a lake, and it always stays muddy. You get a rain, it stays muddy for a week, or it stays muddy, never clears up, or it stays muddy for 2 or 3 days. The ones that stay muddy for 2 or 3 days and finally clear up, probably wouldn't worry about. But I can tell you there's a line when I fly from St. Louis, Missouri to Phoenix, Arizona, And you can look out on the north side of the plain if you just happen to be going just right, and you can see ponds down there, and the ones to the south are muddy, and the ones to the north are clear. There's a line right down through there. The one side clear, the other side's muddy, from the same amount of rain, same period of time. Why is that? The ones that stay muddy, those soils don't have enough calcium. The ones that clear up, those soils have so much calcium that when the soil washes into the pond, there's enough calcium to cause those clay particles. And this is what calcium does. It'll cause the clay particles to gather up or clump up and flocculate and settle to the bottom. So when we have enough calcium, it'll actually clear water up. They use calcium in water treatment plants to clear up the water. If we don't have enough calcium, then the question is how much does it take in order to get that to happen? But magnesium and potassium and sodium do the opposite. They spread clay particles apart and they make the soil tighter. Calcium loosens the soil. Magnesium, potassium, and sodium tighten the soil. So it's important to get those in the right proportions in a soil. Otherwise, we don't have enough pore space for the air and water that we need. And what is it that gives the health to the soil? The living organisms, the plant roots and so forth. Well, that's exactly what we've got to be concerned about. We've got to get the air and water right in the soil, or else the microbes are not going to be right either. We'll talk about that more later. I've still got a minute and a half, but I wanted to have just a little bit of time to tell you what gave me confidence in this program. And that is, when I first started, I just had to take Dr. Albrecht's word for this, but so many people said, that's too complicated. You don't need to know all that stuff. Farmers, all you need to know, or a gardener, all you need to know is the simple stuff. Just pH and phosphorus and potassium, and you can grow a good garden. And you know what? Most people can. But I met a medical doctor in California. He was a medical doctor. But from age 55 to age 72, he said, I've never recommended a drug for any disease. And he said, you can cure any disease without drugs if you have the right nutrition. And the first thing he insisted when anyone came to him was, if you're going to be treated by me, you need to address getting naturally grown or organically grown foods, not foods that have been poisoned and so forth. He said, you got to get good quality food or we can't solve this problem. The reason he had me come, he and his wife had a PhD in microbiology, and they grew their own food in their backyard in Sherman Oaks, California. And when I went to see him, and he had one part of the garden, great looking plant. He had another part of the garden, when they planted anything there, it died. And he said, why can't I grow something here? When we explained it to him, he said, that's what you and I need. That's exactly what everyone needs.